Hello, this is the Freiburg New Church Assembly Lecture Series for August 2020. My name is Reverend Ken Turley, and I'll be speaking today about the three essentials of faith and the church. We've heard a number of presentations on the essentials of our church, and without going into detail, I would like to repeat them, for they are indeed the foundation of belief upon which our church is built. First is the divinity of the Lord, which essentially means believing in and honoring God above all things and in all things. The second is the sacredness of the Word, which means that the Bible is divinely intended and speaks to us in many ways and on many levels, and is intended as much more than simply a literal history. That there is sacredness to be found in the Bible. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the life of charity, which means that one is called to live consistently with our faith, the teachings of the Lord, which can be boiled down, as Jesus said so succinctly, to the two great commandments. Love God with all your heart and soul and mind in all that you're doing. And the second, which is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. So my purpose today really is to talk about church and to make clear what a church is and what a church is not. The church is not its doctrine or its buildings or its organization. It is a shared spiritual marriage of love and wisdom that is the life of any church, no matter what external form it may take. Now we're going to get into the details of that. So consider this. As essential as the doctrine of faith is, upon which we build our church, our faith is no more a church than a slab of concrete is a house. And even a house built upon a solid foundation is only an empty physical structure. It is only the active presence of real, live, loving people in loving relationship to one another that make the structure on a foundation that we call a house, what we call a home. And so it is with the foundation of faith. As solid and secure as it may be, it is nothing more than a lifeless slab of concrete upon which rests a complex but lifeless structure. It is only the living, breathing, spiritually vibrant, real live people who share belief in and commitment to living the wisdom and love of God that make the foundation of doctrinal faith and the complex structure of the organization what Swedenborg defines as a church. Now, throughout the Bible, what we call the written word, there are correspondential representations of church and what it is and what it is not. There are countless references explaining the qualities and problems of church. And perhaps surprising, and then again perhaps not so surprising, there are countless descriptions of the inevitability of the decline and vastation of every form of church that comes into being. Now, do we all know what the word vastation means? It refers to the decline and decay leading to death as a result of losing touch with the essential life-giving aspects of divinity, which primarily is charity. And just like the death of the body followed by the rebirth of the spirit that none of us are going to escape, neither is our beloved denomination going to avoid the process of vastation and rebirth. In fact, if we're to take a cold, hard, and brutally honest look at ourselves, it would seem pretty clear that we are deep into and well along in that very process. However, don't despair. In every case, a church undergoing vastation and the ultimate death, there is always a remnant which carries life forward into the next stage of the life of that church. So when it comes to the concept of church, there are far too many scriptural references throughout the Word and doctrinal descriptions in the writings of Swedenborg to include them all. So today I would like to refer to the earliest biblical description of church, the process of vastation, and then the subsequent rebirth. And that's found in the story of Noah and the ark and the flood. As Swedenborg says many times, the first of any sequence contains all that is to follow. Now, the story of Noah and the ark is familiar to every child who ever attended Sunday school and to every adult who even began reading the Bible. But let me review. From the offspring of Adam and Eve, the human population has begun to grow. Husbands and wives joining, offspring begetting offspring, until, as the good book itself says, every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts turned toward evil. God watched this steady decline, gaining momentum, until repenting of having created them, male and female. However, Noah, and I think we can go so far as to include his wife and family, found favor in the eyes of God. So while God's intention was to destroy every living thing on earth, Noah, his family, and a representative collection of animals, birds, and insects were to be herded into a self-constructed wooden boat, 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. It has a roof and a door and 3 separate levels. And so it is in this structure that they survived the flood. Now, much speculation has gone into how this was even remotely possible, as there are innumerable practical problems that would have to be solved. For those who are focused on the inconsistencies of the literal level, at least one question has been addressed, and that is the problem of dinosaurs. Why were they not on the ark? And how is it that we are finding skeletal remains of dinosaurs even today? Well, as a result of an immense amount of theological and scientific research, an explanation for this question has been provided. So, as entertaining as it is in its literal level, this entire story is offered for a different purpose. And that purpose is to convey the deeper meaning, the coming into being, and the inevitable vastation of the first church on earth. Now, the story of the flood wiping out humanity and Noah and the animals surviving in the ark correspondentially represents the vastation, the devastating end of the then first church, and the rebirth of the next stage of church. The people of the world at that time represent all those of the church who had lost touch with goodness and truth, love and wisdom, and they had turned instead away to all kinds of self-serving lusts and abandoned any semblance of compassion and caring and turned instead to hatred and violence. Noah and his family represent the remnant of sincere human devotion to God and a commitment to the life of charity in spite of all that is going on around them. The animals and birds represent the feelings and thoughts that are preserved within and carried forward. The ark itself represents the loving structure of belief, which protects and carries them through a complete and thorough flood of insight and truth-telling, a kind of mind-blowing intellectual revelation from God, if you will. And this washes clean all of what was before and prepares the way for what is to come next. What is essential to take away from this story is that the coming into being of the church, and then the decline and vastation, followed by the carrying forward and renewal of a remnant of divinely devoted spirit in the rebirth of a new form of church, is an inevitable process that repeats itself over and over again throughout the biblical narrative. As Swedenborg says in Arcana Coelestia 362, wherever there is a church, there arise heresies, because while they are thinking about one article of faith, they make it the chief thing. And again in number 407, with the state of the church in general, the case is this, that in the process of time it recedes from the true faith, and at last ceases to be in none. Thus it was with the most ancient church, and with the ancient church, and with the Jewish church, and with the primitive church. Yet some nucleus of the church always remains, which they who are vastated as to faith do not acknowledge. In 468, Swedenborg says, with the church the case is this, that in the process of time it decreases, and at last remains with a few. The few with whom it remained at the time of the flood are called Noah. Again in number 530, the names in this chapter correspond to churches, or what is the same, doctrines, for it is from doctrine that the church exists and is called the church. The case with the churches or doctrine is that they decrease, even until there is no longer remaining anything of the goods and truths of faith, and then the church is called vastated. But still there are always remains preserved, or some with whom the good and truth of faith remains, although there are few. Unless this were the case, there would be no conjunction of heaven with the human race. And in 1065, Swedenborg says the three sons of Noah correspond to three kinds of doctrines which are carried forth, and those of the churches in general. Ham represents the corrupt church. Shem represents the internal church, and Japheth, the external church corresponding to the internal. There are no more universal kinds. They who do not acknowledge charity or faith or external worship are not of any church. And finally, in 2:3:2:3, Swedenborg says this: the states of the church are in the word compared both to the times of the year and to the times of the day. The state of the church, which is called evening, is when there is no longer any charity. Thus, when there begins to be no faith. Thus, when the church ceases to be. It is provided by the Lord that when the church ceases to be, a new one is raised up, and this at the same time. For without a church somewhere in the globe, the human race could not subsist. There would be no conjunction of it with heaven. So, with all of this, we've established that the church is continually in process, coming into being, maturing, then decreasing in faith and or charity toward complete vastation. But it is then that a small remaining element, renewing itself with the help of the Lord, comes into being as a new form of the church. Now, I'd like to back up for a minute, or slow down, and define the essential term we're talking about here. What is meant by the word church? In that we can't really have conversation, I'll have to answer my own question. What I've derived from my reading of Swedenborg is that church is one of those words that has multiple levels of meaning, similar to neighbor. For Swedenborg, the neighbor is the person sitting right next to us, but at the same time, the neighbor is the person who lives next door to us. It is our community. It is our country. The neighbor is the world, and ultimately the Lord himself. So the word neighbor refers to all those levels of relationship. And our obligation to the neighbor is in direct proportion to the size of the neighbor. Well, so it is with church. It has multiple levels of meaning. I'd like to offer you now a series of quotes, and from this we'll derive a sense of what church is. And then at the end, I'd like to sort of summarize down into what is essential. In AC number 29, paragraph 2, we hear, the kingdom of God, in a less universal sense, corresponds to the Lord's true church. And in AC number 253, Swedenborg writes, it is from the heavenly and angelic proprium that in the word the church is called woman, wife, bride, virgin, or daughter. And then in AC number 262, Swedenborg writes, the woman corresponds to the church here in the perverted church from proprium, which before was signified by the woman. I'd like to take a little detour, if you don't mind, and discuss this word proprium. Now, most people and most references to proprium are as something evil. In my belief, and I realize I am decidedly in the minority on this, I think the proprium is a little broader than that. I see it as something similar to, if not the same thing as ego. And that in this it's a persona, partially conscious but primarily unconscious, that we project out into the world. It is who we want people to believe we are. It's also who we want to believe we are. And we can be at peace or in turmoil depending on how consistent with our outwardly projected persona is with who we truly are inwardly. It's a dominating factor in all of us, and it can easily get out of hand. It can also easily lead us astray without us even realizing it. On the other hand, when our ego or our proprium, our projected persona, is consciously disciplined and sincerely devoted to serving God, then it becomes a tool for God to use, doing the work of heaven here on earth. Proprium, in essence, is our psychological body, if you will. And for good or for evil, it is what we and God have to work with. When it's serving our own selfish needs at the expense of others, then obviously it becomes evil. When it is serving God and the well-being of others, then it becomes, as was referred to, heavenly and angelic proprium. All right. With that said, let us move on regarding church. In AC 637, if the Lord's church were completely extinguished on the earth, the human race could not exist at all. For the church is like the heart. The Lord's church on earth is as the heart. From it, the human race, even those outside of the church, have life. In AC 768, the person of the church is not only the church itself, but the whole of the church. It is a general term comprehending whatever is of the church. There exists with every one of the church the internal of the church and the external of the church. The internal is where the truths of the church are, and the externals what is then derived from it. Now, for those who are counting on Swedenborg to always be consistent with himself, please take note of the following. In AC 769, Swedenborg writes, "The church cannot exist without doctrine." Then, in AC 809, "The church is never predicated from intellectual things," the realm of doctrine, "but from voluntary things. The scientifics, which are merely facts and pieces of information, and the rational of faith never constitute the church or the person of the church, rather charity, which is of the will. Thus neither does what is doctrinal if in general and in specific it does not regard charity. The Lord's church is not unless it is of love and charity." And how this is maintained on earth is described in the following, in AC 932. "Seed will never cease to be sown in humans by the Lord, whether they be within the church or without the church. The Lord's heavenly influx is universal and constant." In AC 6637, paragraph E, "Everyone who lives the good of charity of faith is a church and is a kingdom of the Lord. Combined, however remote they may be from one another, they are the church in general." In AC 10765, Swedenborg says, "They who are out of the church yet acknowledge one God and live according to their religion in a kind of charity toward the neighbor are in communion with those who are of the church. The Lord's church is everywhere in the whole world." Finally, these last two thoughts from Heaven and Hell 57. Heaven corresponds with church. A person is a church in the least form, and many churches make one church. In Heaven and Hell 308 and 318, Swedenborg says, "The church is universal in all who acknowledge the divine and live in charity." And finally, in Apocalypse Revealed, number 66, in reference to the first chapter of the book of Revelation, verse 20, where it says, "The 7 candlesticks which you saw are the 7 churches." Swedenborg says this signifies the Lord's new church on earth, in all its varieties as a one, but various according to their reception. Their variety is like the variety of jewels in a crown, or the various organs of one body. The perfection of every form exist from the variety of things suitably arranged in their order. So an attempt to summarize this. The word church, then, refers to an understanding and belief system coupled with a priority of values. With that belief system focused on the concept of God as the source of life and love and wisdom, and the value system focused on loving compassion for the neighbor as oneself. This can occur within an individual or shared between any number of people from 2 or 3 up to the countless millions. A church refers to one person and to the small community of people who commune together, but it also means a larger organization of which that small community is a part, and like our individual churches are part of our denomination, which we call our church. But it also means the larger organizations that our denomination is part of, in this case the National Council of Churches. But it doesn't end there. The word church also refers to the communities and denominations and individuals all over the world who share some kind of common belief in God and value some form of charity toward the neighbor in their life. And again, I don't want us to forget that other aspect of the word church. We talked about a small community of like-minded people who share a common spirit. But any grouping of those few people may also be referred to as a church, including a single individual with a belief system focused on God and a value system ruled by love for the neighbor. This is a church in its smallest form. What is important to understand from this is that a church is not a body, it's not a structure, it's not an organization, it's not a place. A church is an understanding and a spiritual affection for God held in some sort of commonality. That is what church is. All of those things I just mentioned can be considered church only as they serve as the containment, the vessel, the vehicle, and or the means by which the spiritual union of heart and mind are able to then manifest in the world. In essence, church is defined by the spiritual relationship to God. All of the various manifestations, whether a physical body, a structure, a political organization, or an external commonality of some kind, these are church specifically because of, and only to the degree that, they hold a common belief in God and a shared affection for and desire to be loving kindness. The common mind and heart fixed on and devoted to the God of love and wisdom is what defines church, whether that be within an individual, 2 or 3 gathered, a small or large congregation, a small or large denomination, the worldwide Lord's new church on earth, and obviously, without question, the risen Lord himself. Now, given our earlier learning that churches come into being and then descend into vastation by separating themselves from charity, I thought appropriate to look at how that happens. So prepare yourself, and you might want to take notes. Here is a listing of some of the things that lead to the decline of the church, the errors and mistakes that are the cause of vastation, and signify the dying and death of what once may have been a vibrant church. And make no mistake about it, this is applicable to every form of church, from a single individual to the largest organization of human hierarchy, stopping just short of the Lord himself. In AC 231, The evil of the church is when belief is not in the Lord or the Word, but in oneself or our own senses. In AC 2323 and also in 2905 paragraph 2, when fading away from charity, the church is entering vastation. And for those who'd like to go deeper, if you look to AC number 5432 in paragraphs 3 through 5, there is a detailed and comprehensive description of this. But to put it more succinctly in AC 4692 paragraph 4, when the church turned from charity to faith. In 885, the fast-stated church knows truth but doesn't want to understand it. In AC 916, paragraph 2, the church that has faith without charity is not even a church. And you can find this repeated in other ways in numbers 1249 and 1304. Now, as far as that transformation into the next form of church, in number 409, paragraph E, Swedenborg says, rarely does the church remain with those who possess the truth but are vastated. Rather, it is transformed into others who know nothing whatsoever about the truth. In AC 2400, paragraph 2, there are 3 kinds of church described. 1, those who live in the good of charity. 2, those who live in falsity and evil, especially those who teach. And 3, those who know the truth but still do evil. In AC 6658, paragraph E, Swedenborg says, the church is indeed established with a person when they do what is good from affection, for they do good from the love of doing good. But it is not fully established until having fought against evil and falsity. In other words, undergoing temptations. In conclusion, church is any organized belief in God and commitment to the life of charity. The external form can be an individual person, a small group of 2 or 3, a congregation, a denomination, a national community of denominations, the Lord's new church on earth containing both self-identified Christians and those who identify in other ways but have a sense of the divine and live in charity to the neighbor. And in the most universal sense, the Lord himself in the heavenly realm. All churches that come into being go through the process of life involving growth, maturation, and decline, what Swedenborg calls vastation. This as a result of losing touch with the concept of charity to the neighbor. This leads to death and rebirth via a remnant of devotion that is carried forward into a new form of that church. That decline is directly related to the separation from or loss of a commitment to the life of charity. Doctrine only serves as a foundation to support the structure that provides the means for the Spirit to exercise charity, in other words, love and compassion, goodwill, forgiveness, and healing in our words and actions in the world. In all of this, the life of any kind of church is given, supported, maintained, energized, and preserved by nothing other than the committed spiritual connection to the love and wisdom of God. Amen.